A soldier stands in formation, weapon in hand, waiting for battle. The enemy is visible across the field. The fear is real, but it is manageable. It has a face. Now take that same soldier and march him 500 miles north in the dead of winter, through snow, with wet boots and half rations. No enemy in sight. And the real reason ancient soldiers dreaded winter more than the battlefield is stranger and more brutal than you might expect. Here's the first thing to understand. Ancient warfare was not a year-round enterprise. Nearly every major civilization that fought wars, from Rome to Greece, from the Persian Empire to the armies of medieval Europe, observed what historians call a campaign season. Fighting happened in spring and summer. Armies went home, or to winter quarters, when the cold arrived. This wasn't cowardice. It was survival arithmetic. Because winter didn't just make war uncomfortable. It made war nearly impossible, for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy. Start with food. A Roman legion on the march required enormous quantities of grain, meat, and fodder for its animals every single day. In spring and summer, armies could forage. Fields were productive, local supplies could be requisitioned, and supply lines could move across dry, passable roads. In winter, the ground was barren. Roads turned to mud, then froze, then became rivers of ice that snapped axles and lamed horses. Supply wagons that moved 10 miles a day in summer might cover 2 in winter, if they moved at all. An army that couldn't be fed couldn't fight. And ancient armies starved in winter not because their enemies cut off supplies, but simply because the mathematics of feeding thousands of men and animals in a frozen landscape were almost impossible to solve. Then there was cold itself, and this is the part that surprises people. Ancient soldiers did not have the clothing technology that modern people take for granted. Wool was the primary insulating material, and wool has a critical weakness. When it gets wet, it loses most of its insulating ability. Ancient soldiers marched in wet conditions, slept on wet ground, crossed rivers and streams in their gear, and spent days and nights in temperatures that their clothing was simply not designed to handle. Historian and classicist Adrian Goldsworthy, who has written extensively on the Roman military, has noted that exposure in cold-related illness killed far more soldiers than enemy weapons in nearly every extended winter campaign of the ancient world. This is where it gets interesting. The diseases that followed cold were even more lethal than the cold itself. Crowded into winter quarters, sleeping in close proximity, sharing food preparation areas and water sources, soldiers became perfect vectors for epidemic disease. Dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and respiratory illness tore through winter camps with a ferocity no enemy army could match. Military historian Victor Davis Hanson has documented case after case in which ancient armies entered winter with tens of thousands of men and emerged in spring with a fraction of that force, not from battle losses but from disease, exposure, and starvation, all of which winter made dramatically worse. Think about what frostbite meant for an ancient soldier. No understanding of its mechanism. No treatment beyond warming a limb that might already be beyond saving. A soldier who lost fingers or toes to frostbite lost his ability to grip a weapon, to march, to function as a fighting man at all. In a pre-medical era, a frostbitten wound could become infected within days. An infection in an ancient army camp was often a death sentence. What the enemy couldn't do in a pitched battle, winter could accomplish quietly, overnight, in a tent. Perhaps the most striking example of winter as a military force is the retreat of Napoleon's Grande Armée from Moscow in 1812, but its ancient precursors are equally devastating. The Persian king Cambyses II sent an army of approximately 50,000 men across the western Egyptian desert toward the oracle at Siwa in 525 BC. Ancient accounts, and some modern archaeological evidence, suggest the army was overwhelmed by a massive sandstorm. But the broader lesson of armies destroyed by environment rather than enemies runs through ancient history like a dark thread. Alexander the Great lost more men to the brutal conditions of his march through the Gedrosian desert than to any single battle. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps remains one of history's most studied military disasters, not for the fighting but for the environment. He arrived in Italy with perhaps half the force that had entered the mountains, the rest lost to cold, altitude, rockfalls, and disease. This also explains something historians have noted about the psychological effect of winter on ancient armies. Soldiers who could face death in battle with courage, who had trained for years to hold formation under fire, frequently broke in spirit under sustained cold and hunger. There is something uniquely demoralizing about suffering without an opponent to defeat. You cannot charge at frostbite. You cannot outmaneuver dysentery. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere, invisible and relentless, and it takes not just lives but morale, discipline, and the shared belief that the army can win. So here's the modern mirror. Modern military logistics, cold weather gear, and field medicine have transformed what winter means for soldiers in ways ancient commanders couldn't have imagined. But the underlying reality, that environment is a combatant, that cold and disease and starvation have always killed more soldiers than swords or arrows, shaped military strategy for thousands of years. Every ancient general who paused at the edge of a campaign season was making a calculation that was not about cowardice but about survival. The campaign season wasn't tradition. It was the hard-learned knowledge that the season itself was one of the most dangerous enemies an army could face. A soldier stands in formation, watching the enemy across the field. He knows how that fight ends. What he doesn't know is whether the winter march that brought him here has already decided his fate before the first sword is drawn.